What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. Not long ago, we posed the question, how would the Pokemon world look if for whatever reason, they were not allowed to have dual typings? How would each Pokemon change if they could only have the characteristics of a single type? An idea that's so fun and original that maybe MNJTV will steal this one without credit someday too. Well, last time we saw the Kanto region shaken up, so what would happen if we moved over to the Johto side of things? Well, funnily enough, all of the starter Pokemon are actually already a single type, so I think that they were vying for some extra credit. And even the Centret line meet the criteria as well, so our first considerations are Hoothoot and Noctowl, who are usually normal in flying, and I think we know that at least for most birds, they are more fitting as flying types. I do believe that a creature could still be able to fly without that specific element, however they don't seem overly plain when compared to their potential for flight, so I would recommend having them be pure flying. Although honestly, I would probably say Noctowl could get away with being pure psychic instead, but I'm not going to be switching out any types, only working within the existing framework. So then our next early route staples are Ladybug and Ladian, and I think it's pretty clear that they would be bug type. I mean, they are the regional bugs, and we'll see a bit later that we do need to hold on to our bug types while we can. Like with our buddy Spinarak here, I would say that these spiders distinguish themselves enough as poison types to have that be their primary trait. After all, its signature toxic thread certainly shows off its venomous nature, and with only 4 poison types across all of Johto, I think it's pretty fitting to keep them repping that type. However, conversely, we have Crobat, who you may not agree, but I actually think he should be a flying type. Last time we had the Zubat line stay poison, which made sense. But if you look at Crobat, it seems designed to be extra sleek and aerodynamic, even growing an extra pair of wings for maneuverability, so I think the whole point of it evolving at all was to enhance its flying capabilities, so switching to that type in the final stage would really highlight that emphasis. Then we have Chinchou and Lantern, who are fish, yes, but even though they live in the water, I think electric would be best. It's more believable to have electric types with gills than fish that randomly have lightning-powered anglers for no discernible reason. But they could still maybe get the water absorbability to keep that connection going if you want. Then, just like last time, I would make Igglybuff a pure fairy type, because it really fits better than being pure normal type, despite it being that for the majority of its life still. And since I always forget that Togepi dropped the normal type completely and isn't a dual type, I would recommend that Togetic join the trend and swap to pure fairy as well. I know it started out as 2 completely different types, and now it's solely going to be a third, but I do think it makes the most sense, because fairies notoriously fly all the time. Plus the wings on its back would more than justify it being airborne even without the flying type attached. Then we have the Maroline, who can drop the fairy type for a change. I mean, these aqua rodents were clear water types from the very beginning anyway, so as much as the fairy type has helped them, we're not really looking at what would make them the most competitively viable, but what works best in their lore and design. So speaking of, that brings me to Natu, who would be most fitting as the flying type. This guy is such a tiny, compact bird that there's really not any other type that's able to be packed in there. However, when it evolves, I do think that Xatu should be a psychic type. If the wings weren't enough, it could stay aloft with its new ESP, plus the dex entries for how it peers into the past and the future demand that this avian Aztec have some sort of extrasensory acumen, and the split only proves how pronounced that change becomes. Then there's the whole Hoppip line, who should probably stay grass. The novelty of them being flying type was appreciated at the time, but as the years have gone on, it's honestly become more of a liability than anything else. Most of their best tricks having nothing to do with the fact that they're in midair at all. So I think that the blooming cottonweeds probably deserve to stay plants. I got a bit of flack last time for labeling Scyther as flying type, but hopefully I can explain myself better with Yanma, as it will be the same. Yes, this dragonfly Pokemon is an insect, so that could make it the bug type. However, I find it very important to expand the flying type beyond just your standard birds, because that would be so boring, and not at all capture the spirit of the sky element in the first place. Plus, Yanma has a much bigger emphasis on flight than Scyther ever did, to the point that I'm not even sure if it ever touches the ground at all. But speaking of ground, we just lost 2 of them, since Wooper and Quagsire should stay water types. I get that they are mudfish and all, but I could see some water types adapting to their dirtier climate by taking on some attacks and such. But really, any arguments that they should stay ground kinda went out the window for me once we saw their Paldean brethren instead. Sort of the opposite of Yanma, we have Murkrow proving that birds can go somewhere else by becoming a pure dark type. I'm not saying that flying doesn't fit here, but if there was one other pure dark Pokemon originally in Johto besides Umbreon, I would have believed that it was Murkrow. And since we are introducing the type here, they need to keep all that they can get. Slowking comes next, and once again, I feel that it's best to be pure Psychic type, even more so than the other members of its family. Even if the Slowpoke line had stayed water, Slowking's enhanced brain makes it an easy candidate to go for Psychic. Not dissimilar, we also have Girafarig, who I would also place in the Psychic column. This living palindrome has a bit too much going on to be pure normal, and if nothing else, we need to maintain the low-level telepathy working between its two heads, so I would buy this miniature giraffe as a Psychic-type Pokemon. Then there's Forretress, and honestly, I know that it's metal and all, but I would believe this bagworm could pull off being pure bug. You could still have it be tanky by dumping in huge HP and defensive stats to be able to take a punch, but I'm also kind of doing it to differentiate it from the other steely bug from this region. But then we skip over to Gligar, and I think it's best to hold on to that flying typing. I mean, they are all about gliding, it's right there in the name, and of the two, it's honestly more obvious how it's poisonous than living in the desert. And once again, it's nice to shake things up with some variety to show that the flying type has more to offer. And sadly, Steelix would obviously ditch the ground typing as well. Last time people said Onix shouldn't be a rock type to better connect to Steelix, but I'm not sure they're understanding how this works, because Steelix would indeed be a steel type. And honestly, it makes more sense to go from hard rock to even harder steel, but I don't think anyone will fight me on this because we do need to have steel type reps. And then we have Quillfish, who is in a surprisingly similar scenario, because we also really need to keep up those poison types. And like we've said already, Pokemon can be other types while living in the water. And besides, focusing on its poisonous barbs makes Quillfish stand out a lot more while surfing or fishing than all of the other pure water types out there. Okay, so here we have Scizor, and of course, as I alluded to before, he will be staying pure steel. I think it would be a good contrast to have these Pokemon that used to share each split and take one half so that they can better stand apart from one another, rather than mistaking them for being relatives. Now, I was considering doing the same for Shuckle and turn it into a rock type, but honestly, it barely makes sense to be rock now, with it being more connected to the berry juice inside rather than a stone shell. So Bug 100% makes sense to me for this moldy Pokemon. And I guess that goes for the next one in Heracross as well. This blue beetle might just be the most bug-looking bug type out there, and as much as I would love to rationalize the fighting type to keep more than just the Hitmon relatives, Heracross actually should be bug to better match up with Pinsir, since after its previous adversary went and evolved, they paired these beetles together as rivals, so both being pure bug would make the matchup a lot more fair, so Heracross gets it too. For Sneasel, I think Ice should probably be used here. I know, it looks dark. But not only is that an offensive stereotype, but we have seen Ice types that look weird before. And since Sneasel lives up in the mountains, it works for me. Besides, if we don't do this, we'll have basically no Ice types in Johto at all. So I'm fine with sacrificing the Dark type for the sake of balance. As for Magcargo, I think it's pretty obvious to keep it Fire. I do think that the Rock-type shell was a clever idea, but in every other way it's basically identical to its previous stage, who is a pure Fire type. So how could it change types without really changing anything at all? Meaning that Fire is pretty much a given. What I said about Ice is largely because of Swinub and Piloswine, who I would make Ground instead. I love Ice being combined with Ground here, but you wouldn't even really know that these Pokemon were Ice if it weren't for the Dex, so I think it would be fine to lean on their Ground sides, especially when there are so few of those, and just uniquely have lots of Frosty coverage. And of course right after is Corsola, and really I think the Rock type is undisputed. Sure, it resides in the water, but it's a chunk of coral. You might not classify coral as rock, but that's about the closest that we've got in Pokemon types, so it would be yet even more variety while surfing to get a rock type on the high seas. And finally, with Deliberate, we have more ice. It's questionable if it can even fly at all sometimes, but a Santa-themed penguin just screams ice, does it not? At least Deliberate is good for something in letting us have ice this generation. However, the opposite holds true for Mantine, who I would make into a flying type. A Manta Ray is a nice aquatic base, but concentrating on spreading its wingspan to take off would once again provide variety within the flying type, not to mention setting it apart from its symbiotic Remoraid, and I'm sure that soaring the skies would bring Mantine a lot more joy as well. Then we bounce back because Skarmory is losing flying again to be a pure steel type. As established, Pokemon can fly as long as they have wings. They don't necessarily need that element, but if any Pokemon in Johto was going to be steel type, it would be the vicious raptor made out of swords. And maybe this would finally be enough to have Jasmine take notice and use one. Now, I was honestly torn on Houndour and Houndoom because they are both very clearly evil, but also fiery, but ultimately I think we will see them as dark. The Skull and Bones motif really puts them in the Hot Topic camp, plus they can still breathe out some fire-type coverage moves, and this way it helps to balance out the new types being added this generation. But of course, Kingdra is a mandatory dragon type. It's literally the singular dragon in the entire Johto roster, and we would be completely without the type if Seadra didn't change upon evolution. So this is no contest to drop that water label. And actually, I totally forgot to even include Smoochum in this exercise at all until I was basically done, but I guess I'll stick to my guns and give it the ice typing as well. I could see where some people disagreed with Jinx being ice, however the baby form is even less psychically based, observing things through its lips instead of any brainwaves, so adding in an extra surprise ice type at the last minute is pretty good with me. But then actually we already see monotypes all the way until Larvitar, and the pseudo-legendary was honestly pretty tricky, because I was trying to rationalize them all being different types, but realistically I think Rock covers them all pretty well enough. Larvitar is said to basically eat a mountain when it's born, Pupitar is nothing more than a living chunk of slate, and Tyranitar's skin is impressively tough, so getting some last-ditch Rock types to bolster the decks works out pretty great for everybody. And of course we have the other legendary Pokemon starting with Lugia, and really, even though Lugia is not super connected to the Psychic type, I am going to go with that, but I'll come back to it because I have to point out that Ho-Oh will be the Flying type. See, we already had Moltres as a fire type before. Not only does this set Ho-Oh apart, but with it being the rainbow Pokemon, I would pair it with the sky since that's where you're gonna find them. So then that led me to think that Lugia needed its own type, so Psychic it is. I mean, those things barely look like wings anyway, if you ask me. Although, truthfully, if I had my way, I would make Lugia pure water, because that truly fits it best, but like we said, that's not on the cards. And lastly, we have Celebi, and considering there's still a fight on whether it even should be Psychic versus Fairy type, I think Pure Grass is more than fitting for this time-traveling Forest Guardian. So, those are all of the Johto Pokemon if they could only have a single type. Quite an interesting turnout, with types like Electric and Grass keeping all of their members, whereas Poor Ground gets cut in half. Water and Normal stick to the top as usual, but once again I'm surprisingly impressed with how big a portion Psychic takes up. But that's how the even 100 Pokemon of Gen 2 get divvied up by single types. So, what single types would you assign the Johto Pokemon? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.